So today we're going to talk about archiving data from the audit tables of your SharePoint content databases. ControlPoint has the ability to take data from multiple content databases that are stored in the audit data tables and actually push them onto a separate SQL database. There are a couple of steps that you have to take in order to set up and configure that process, though, so we'll be able to walk through those and also provide you with some additional information on how to get the resources that you need to actually set that up. So clicking through to our agenda today, we're going to talk about how to report on the audit log data that you already have in SharePoint, how to find out where audit log data is being used and what databases store a large amount of audit log data. And then we're going to move on to the process of actually setting up, creating, and configuring your database for archived audit log entries. After we do that, we're going to talk about the actual process of archiving that audit data and the different options that ControlPoint gives you to perform that audit. And then we're going to conclude by providing you with some links to additional information on the Metalogix website, documentation, and knowledge bases. And then we'll go ahead and answer any questions that come up during the actual webinar. So instead of going through a slideshow, we're actually going to switch over to an actual instance of the ControlPoint application that I have open on one of our test environments here. This is just a standard out-of-box version. It's actually using the newest version of ControlPoint 5.4, 5.3. That's why you check before the webinars. But 5.4 will actually be the exact same, and we do recommend getting onto 5.4. We just haven't gotten to the process of upgrading all of our internal environments yet. So the first step before you want to go through the process of archiving your audit log data is confirming that you really have a need to, that your site collections are actually storing audit data, that they're storing a large amount of audit data, and to find out exactly where in your environment audit data is being used. And ControlPoint has a few different reports that can actually show you that. One of the ones that I like to use is one of our storage reports called the Content Database Storage Report. This will separate all the content databases being used by your web application, and it'll actually separate them into which components are being used and how much space is being used by those components. So if I run this report, and it'll run pretty fast on my test environment, what it will show me is each of my content databases. Here's my standard WSS content database, and it'll actually show some information about the storage that's being used. My actual data file is about 2,400 megabytes, but what I care about in this case is actually taking a look at my audit log size. 46.77 megabytes is not very much. 29,000 records is not very much. I've run into situations where people have 100, 150, 200,000 entries per hour in a large environment. So there's not much need to archive 50 megabytes worth of data, but maybe you have a year's worth, a year and a half worth. And when you're in a situation like that, that's when you really need to have that kind of externalized, because having this data off of the content database increases your end user's ability to actually hit this data. It makes it easier for pages to load. The overall performance is increased. So we've built into ControlPoint the ability to actually set up a separate database and move the archived audit log data over to that database. So you're probably, if you are familiar with the ControlPoint application, you're aware that we use a service database called xadmin. For the archived audit log data, we actually recommend using a separate database. And if I navigate over to my database server here, I've actually moved the scripts that we need to do to create this database over to this server. Back on my actual web server, you can find these inside the ControlPoint installation package under the ControlPoint features folder. They're called Script Create Audit Archive Indexes and Script Create Audit Archive Tables. So when I navigate back to my SQL server, you'll see I have my xadmin database, but it's really not a best practice to store that archived audit log data in the xadmin database. You'd be offsetting it from your content database only to put it onto another database that is going to be actually in use quite a bit. Whoops. So what I'll actually want to do is create a new database, and I can really let SQL do that for me. There's no special configuration that has to be taking place when you first create that database other than the scripts that we've already copied over here. My database name can be whatever I want, but I'll have to remember what that name is, write it down, copy it to Notepad, anything like that to make sure that you can reference it later. I like to call mine XC Archive. XC, just like XC Admin, so I remember what it is. Archive to remind me that it's actually archive database. So I'll actually go ahead and just create it as such. The actual growth rate is fine. The archive process will write data to it as needed. And here's my database. Now it's a very basic database. There's nothing going on with it yet. We just allowed SQL to create a default database. So what I want to do is actually, I like to copy these over. I think that's just a personal preference. We'll create our tables. Whoops, it's actually the invite to the meeting. There we go. And I'll just allow this to execute against the specific database that I created. The query by default doesn't know what database to use. We have to define it to use the database that we created previously. So if I execute that, really simple process, I can expand out my tables and I can see that the audit log transfer table, where the audit data will be stored, has already been created on this. And that's just a simple process of copying this back over, setting up another new query, copying that information back in, and we don't want to execute that against the service application database. We want to execute that against our archive database. And command completed successfully. So setting up the database is a really simple process, and we've provided you with the scripts to configure it, but you do have to remember that you do have to set up your own database beforehand. It's as simple as clicking on New Database through SQL. You can do whatever configuration you'd like to it, but you just have to create it, run those two commands against it. And one last item, you do want to navigate over to the security for the database and make sure that your control point service account for that environment has DB owner rights to this database. I'm actually going to do it through security. I'll check my logins. This is my service account. We'll navigate over to user mapping. We'll see it's DBO. I'm actually logged in as my service account right now. You may not be when you actually go through the process of creating that database. Your database administrator may create it for you. But if you don't, make sure that that service account has DB owner right to this database. Not that I'm really executing much, but now with that in place, our database is all set. There's one step that you do have to take to connect that database back to control point. And what we'll do is navigate over to our control point configuration site, which is the root site collection that the control point application actually sits on. You're probably already familiar with it if you've ever had to do any kind of configuration with control point. So we'll let this load, and once we're loaded up, we'll navigate over to the control point settings list. The data that we want to go ahead and modify is under the audit log category. There are a few categories that we'll actually want to modify as part of the setup, and a few that we can leave alone because they're not really used for the archive process. They're used more for the audit log reporting process. So the biggest one to note is the archive audit log connection string. We have to create a SQL connection string that points back to that archive database. Usually what I like to do, rather than writing a whole one out, is use the one that control point has already created for us for the XCAdmin database. That's our XCAdmin connection string. I'm actually just going to go ahead, copy it, edit this parameter. We'll enter this parameter value, and we'll make sure to change the database name over to the archive database that we've already created. There are a couple of other parameters that you can change. You don't have to change them, but you have the ability to if you want to further fine-tune the archive process. We have archive audit log included web applications. This is just a GUID list of the actual web applications that you want to archive using the archive audit log process. It's a good opportunity to keep that separate and archive to an individual web application one at a time. Just archive, let's say, audit logging for your portal site. switch over to archive audit logging for a different web application, it's a way to keep those separate and archive only some content at a time. The other option is archive audit log process interval. By default, you're actually going to archive 1 hour worth of data at a time, starting with the oldest data that you have available in your archive audit log tables. You can actually increase that process interval to archive 2 hours, 3 hours, 6 hours at a time, but it'll take it in slices, so it's not as though it's just going to archive 1 hour and then wait for your input next. It's going to archive hour 1, hour 2, hour 3, and keep on going unless that process is interrupted by an application pool recycle or an IIS reset or something else that will cut it off. We'll talk about that in a moment. The other options really are mostly defined for your audit log analysis reporting. Things like your process audit names is more of a special purpose category that you'd only use if you ran into a pretty specific bug that we've seen with the actual data that's being stored in SharePoint. And then excluded users audit is more used for service accounts, application pool accounts, accounts that you know are writing entries to the audit log database, but that your business users or your management or people that care about the reports don't actually want to see or have to sift through to get the data that they actually need. And that's just a comma-separated list of names. The other one that we do want to pay attention to actually is our audit max days parameter. Basically, that's the number of days that will keep the records in the content database. Again, it's not really relevant for the archive process, but something to keep in mind is that you can do a combination of factors. You can archive a certain amount of time, but actually also delete really old data. This is set to 0. It will not affect that audit log table. But if you set that to a higher number, like 180, 365, it'll directly delete that data out from the audit log tables of the content databases. Again, not really relevant to the archive process, but it's something to be aware of if you're working with audit log data in SharePoint and Control Point. So after I make that change to the archive audit log connection string, I'd like to do an recycle of the Control Point application pool, not necessarily a full IIS reset, but there have been some parameters here and there you do have to do a recycle. And in my eyes, it's best just to do it if you're going to make a change to any of the parameters, unless there is something like an active discovery running or a job that you currently have running that's going to be cut off by that. Since we're just doing this for our demonstration, I'll just go ahead and recycle it. So we're at a point right now where we have our archive audit log table created. We have the connection made within SharePoint itself, within Control Point itself, pointing back to that archive table. And now the question becomes, how do I get that data from from content databases over to our archived databases? There are a few different ways you can do that. The first is actually going to be through a page that we have on the Control Point application. I can navigate over to my default, and I've actually loaded it. It's XC archive audit logs.aspx. You don't need to remember that right now. It will be in the guides that we provided. So if I navigate over to this, while this is loading, we did get a question, hey, why would we want to do this? There's a few different reasons that I've ran into in my experience working with clients. A lot of it's making the databases smaller or more manageable. There is a performance uptick to removing the audit log data if there's a lot of audit log data. If you have a year and a half, 2 years, 3 years of audit log data, externalizing that does increase performance. And we've also run into situations, actually in a couple of cases, where people still want that audit data, but they actually want to archive it and move it off of SharePoint. They want to keep it for legal reasons, compliance reasons, HIPAA, financial regulations, things like that, where they need that information, but they don't necessarily need it accessible all the time. So there's a few different reasons you'll want to do it. You may not want to do it, but it's a nice feature that's built into Control Point that overall does have effect in a few different areas. So here's my archive audit logs option. If I'm archiving my audit data through the Control Point application, there's a few steps, and I apologize for the image for the node not being visible here. I'm not sure why that's going on, but what I want to do, I'm actually going to add the web application that we reported on earlier, my SharePoint 80 web application, and apply it. So I'm reporting on just this web application, archiving that information. Under my parameters, I can select to keep a certain number of days in the audit log. Maybe I want 2 months of data in the actual active audit log, and then older data past then archived. One of the downsides, and one of the few downsides, honestly, is the fact that SharePoint itself, if I'm running through audit log analyses within SharePoint, can't necessarily read from our archived databases. So you may want that early data still stored in SharePoint so end users that don't have access to Control Point or don't actively use Control Point can still see it. But in my case, since this is a pretty Control Point heavy shop, I'm going to go ahead and select 0 days. We'll move all that data out to that archived audit log database. And we'll select Run Now. You may end up running into a situation, if you have a lot of audit log data, where you're not able to just click Run Now and archive that data. It's not necessarily as easy if you have 2 years worth of data than sitting here and letting that archive over 2 hours. It's just too much data to do in that time. So what we do see people like to do at times is set this up to run regularly, maybe run for a few hours every day at night or something like that after your end users have utilized regular SharePoint or regular Control Point, and we can actually assign extra resources to that process. So we'll let this spin over here, but I do want to show you the other application that we have available to help you with that archive process. If I navigate back to my Control Point features directory, there is an application here called xcutilities.exe, and this is basically a Control Point utility that allows us to do a number of different things, and I'll show you those, but before we go into there, we have to open the config file up for it, and we have to confirm that our actual data source for our XCadmin database is actually pointing back to the correct XCadmin database server. So I'm going to go ahead and change that. And you know, sometimes I just forget it. And I like to go back and look at my Control Point settings list just to make sure that I'm not making any typos or anything like that. Since I just recycled the application pool earlier, it's going to take a second to load up. And I'll navigate over my Control Point settings list and take a look at my XCadmin connection string. Really, I want this to match what I have in the XC utilities exe config file. So now that we've gone ahead and put that data in there, we can go ahead and save this file. Whoops, I don't want to save as, I just want to save it. Oh, you know what, this is just a UAC error. We'll go ahead and close out of this, open Notepad as an administrator, and navigate over to that config file. Okay, so we have that in place. We can go ahead and save this and close out of here. And now we'll go back to our XC Utilities application and we'll go ahead and run it. Now it's nothing pretty, it's just a basic utility that allows us to do a few sort of command line actions directly through this, this application here. I can run the discovery process, I can run our scheduled job review to kick off any scheduled jobs, and I can archive my audit log data. You see this is set up 0 days to keep in SharePoint, very, very similar to our display here. But what's nice about the Control Point utility is that I can then go from here and set up a Windows scheduled task to actually point back to this utility. This utility takes a few arguments, takes a /discovery /archive audit log /scheduler that allow us to do these different tasks directly as a scheduled task and keep it out of SharePoint a little bit. So this allows us to schedule this. I'm not necessarily going to go through the process of showing you how to schedule a Windows scheduled job because we do have documentation about that, and we may actually cover that a little bit more detailed in a future quick take or as part of our Metalogix Academy series. So that basically covers the process of creating the archived audit log database, setting it up to communicate with Control Point, and the different ways that you can actually write directly from SharePoint's content databases back into the archive database using Control Point. One thing that I definitely want to highlight is that we have this a little bit more detailed on our website, metalogix.com. If I navigate over to our product downloads and resources, Control Point documentation, and there are a few different options that are available here. We have our release notes and what's new and our installation guides and all the information that we already have here, but one of the big things to take a look at is our administration guide, which covers a lot of the maybe slightly more advanced configurations for Control Point, things that aren't what reports provide what information, the initial setup and installation process of Control Point. This is a little bit more of a configuration and troubleshooting guide. In fact, it actually was called the Configuration and Troubleshooting Guide up until this 5.4 release, where we set this up to basically be a little bit more in line with our other Metalogix applications. This should have additional information about our configuration settings, about purging the XCadmin database, about setting up multiple domains, but the one that we actually care about here, archiving SharePoint audit log data. This has additional information about how the process works, tips and tricks for archiving large amounts of data, archiving, years back. So there's some great information in here that I definitely recommend taking a look at. We can cover the basic process on our meeting here, but we can't necessarily cover all the information you see here, although they are talking about a lot of what we just did, setting up the database, creating the connection string, running the process. So it's definitely worth taking a look at because it definitely goes into a little bit more detail about what we talked about in our meeting right here, and it's a good reference if you're actually running through the process to have the steps in front of you once you go take care of that. So that covers the information that we wanted to talk about today, or a quick take about archiving audit log data. For anybody that has joined late or maybe missed part of the webinar, again, this has all been recorded. It'll be posted on our knowledge base at metalogix.com, along with all of the other previous quick takes that we actually had. And if you navigate to the Metalogix website, you can actually see some upcoming quick takes that we have scheduled here for different replicator, backup, content matrix. And funny enough, on September 24th, or excuse me, we've already had September 24th. Looks like we're a little bit behind on here. Using Windows scheduled tasks and the XC utilities executable to run Control Point actions. So that actually should be on our knowledge base now. So that's a good place to take a look if you want to talk about archiving audit log data through that XC utilities application and setting up Windows scheduled tasks to help you out with that. So that covers it on our end. I definitely am more than willing to answer any questions you have. There should be a question pane on your sort of webinar console here. Feel free to ask any questions that you have, and I will answer them, or any recommendations that you have for future quick takes, things you want additional information on. We are definitely taking people's input on these meetings. I actually think this is a direct result of someone asking for this on a quick take. So we definitely listen to your recommendations, and we want to make sure that we provide the most relevant information for what people are actually using Control Point to do. So we'll give a couple minutes for people to type out any questions they have. Somebody did ask, is there going to be a performance impact on the SharePoint web servers when the archive jobs are running? And that's a good question. It's definitely your results may vary kind of situation. If you're sitting with a server that is absolutely maxed out on memory and processor space, and you're running this process against every web application on a farm that's doing a lot of archiving for a lot of different content databases, then yeah, I mean, you could have an impact. From my experience, for the most part, there is not that much impact. We're utilizing some of SharePoint's own APIs to actually pull that audit data. It's not a direct database pull from the audit log tables. We're taking it from SharePoint, requesting that data. So that's actually our biggest bottleneck, rather than the actual performance of the server. So to be honest with you, most of my experience says no. I can't guarantee no, because if you're right on the edge as far as specs and resources are concerned, you might run into an issue, but overall, from my experience, I would say 99.9% of the time it is not an issue. It does not bring down any servers. It does not impact performance. It does not slow anything down. But it's a good question, and I know, there's real reason for that concern, obviously. Okay, I think that covers it. Obviously, if there are any questions or concerns that I didn't cover today, feel free to contact our support team. We have a worldwide support line at 202-609-9100. And we'd be happy to answer any of your questions or get a ticket opened to address any issues with the archiving process or anything else you run into when using ControlPoint. So once again, folks, I just want to thank everybody for joining us here today. We'll have this posted on the Metalogix knowledge base shortly, and good luck with your archiving.